Hi, welcome back. As promised, we are back with our next talk, my journey from architecture to game design, key lessons and versatile skills by Teresina Ho. Teresina is a game and level designer at Half Past Yellow. She started her career as an architecture designer in Hong Kong before moving into the exciting world of 3D art, EdTech, and eventually game design. She particularly enjoys using spaces and visuals as design tools to tackle challenges in her work. Please welcome her on stage.
Um, okay, is the mic working? Great. Uh, yeah, so I'm Teresina. I'm a game and level designer from Half Past Yellow, and I'm here today to share some things I've learned in my journey from architecture to game design that might be useful for game designers or designers in general, really. So a little bit about me. I'm originally from Hong Kong, where I got my architecture degree. After I graduated, I worked as an architectural designer for a year. Did not like it at all. Wasn't sure if it was because of the nature of the work or if it was the work culture in Hong Kong. So then I sent my portfolio to all the different places, and that landed me an architecture internship in Copenhagen. I did that for another year. Oh, and concluded that working in the architecture field was just not as creative as I thought. And there were too many constraints, like structural constraints, limitations about what materials to use, zoning laws, etc. So when time came for me to apply for a master's education, as one does, if I were to become a licensed architect, something else caught my eye in the Royal Danish Academy of Arts, and that was the Visual Game and Media Design program. So I ended up doing that instead, graduated, became a 3D artist at an educational technology company, and in that same company, transitioned into being an educational game designer, and here I am now as a game and level designer at Half Past Yellow. So with this journey in mind, next, I would like to go through some examples of specific things that I learned in architecture and designing course materials, and yeah, basically things that can also be applied to game design. Starting with scale and proportions. So this is one of the things that I learned in architecture school that I still find super useful to this day. It is about how humans interact with their surrounding environments and being aware that, for example, a floor ceiling height is roughly 3 meters tall, a table is roughly 75 centimeters tall, and on average, a stair step is maybe roughly 18 centimeters. And knowing these is useful because then when you have to build something, both in reality and in game worlds, it helps to create a more realistic and usable environment. So while realism doesn't always matter in games, it helps to have that knowledge so then you can build from a baseline and create something interesting. So the famous French architect, Le Corbusier, I don't speak French, so I'm not going to attempt to say that properly, but came up with this system. This is like an anthropometric scale, or a human scale of proportions, if you will, used to improve the aesthetics and functions of architecture. And to elaborate on this a little bit, as you can see here, at 27 centimeters tall, it makes for a pretty nice loungy kind of seat. And if we brought it up a little higher, to 43, this is where the average human would be able to sit up on a chair comfortably. So this will probably make for a nice height for a desk chair. And then at 113 centimeters, this is a pretty nice height to lean against, but at the same time, it's higher than most waists of human beings, if that makes sense. So this measurement would be good for a railing. So yeah, you get the idea. And as you may have noticed, this whole thing was built on the measurements of a 183 centimeter tall average male. I don't actually think people are that tall, but yes. The gist of this is to have standardized measurements to work with, so then things feel good. and you have an easy reference for when you need to build things. Yeah, so if you use this, also be sure to adjust it accordingly, depending on who you're building for and what you're trying to build. So for example, I'm a shorty. If I wanted to build myself a house, this will not work. I will want to adjust it and scale it down so then it's something that's of my proportions. Knowing what the standards are helps because then it helps to tell stories. We can manipulate scales to do that. If you look at this house, who do you think this dwelling is for? Is it an elf, a human, or a Sasquatch? Probably an elf, right? And we know that because there is a sense of scale. We can also make things disproportionately big or small, so then viewers will immediately know that this is a fantasy world like you're seeing in Alice in Wonderland. There is no way something like this will happen in real life. Yeah. But scale is not just about the relative size of objects. It also influences how characters move through spaces. And in the context of games, I'll also talk a little bit about it. So next, we will look at the characters in a tower defense platformer that we're making, and a few ways of using scale to affect how the player moves through the environment. So this is Phi, our player character. He has character settings like jump force, running speeds, object throw force, etc., like all the other video game characters. And using his character settings, we tested optimal distances for different types of movements in the game. For example, the first example here is the jump height. We built different steps with different proportions, so then we could jump around in the scene with Phi's character settings. And what you see here, red are the measurements that we find are either too low, unnecessary, or just impossible. Green is the feel-good window, and yellow indicates what's possible but feels meh, probably because you're landing on right at the edge, and it's just not nice to be bounced off, or just feel like you're just able to make it, but it feels glitchy. Another example is jump distance. We also tried to measure what feels nice to jump across with the player character that we have. And compared to the previous slide, there are some slight differences in color coding in here. On top of telling people how good it feels to jump across these distances, the colors also map out the difficulty of pulling off those jumps. So green here, pretty easy to do, and it also feels good. And then the yellow right here, it's hard, technically possible, but it involves practice and precision. So it feels good only if you land it, and if you don't, which is most of the time, it's not great. So we use that sparingly and reserve those for more difficult platforming challenges. And yeah, the red is just impossible. So likewise, you can do similar things with object throw distances, like testing how far objects can be thrown from a spot, if you're elevated or not. And in our case, our player also has a broom that it can waft to create gusts of winds that would affect contraptions in the world. So we also did some testing with the waft distance. So yeah, this is our little player movement test scene. It's definitely worth taking some time to make a playground like this, especially for a platformer game that focuses on movement, because then you get to run around, get a feel of what's nice and what isn't, and then make adjustments accordingly. So, some more examples. We also tested whether there's enough landing space before another jump when you're going up the stairs. So if it's not enough depth right there, it will break the flow when you land, and you end up bumping into something else, and that doesn't feel nice, so we want to avoid that. And this is the waft distance that I was talking about. If there are bombs right there, and the intent is to enable players to waft at them, so then they fall right on the path where enemies pass by, is this a good distance? Is it too close or too far? Is it even doable? Yeah, and we also have rulers in Engine that we use as spacers. It's just basically blocks that we move around in fixed in fixed distances. So then it becomes easier to plan jumps and mold the environment accordingly when we're doing blockouts. So a little bit of gameplay here. The jump right here, we used something of normal difficulty because you need to hit both buttons in order for that bridge to appear. And while we want it to be a little technical, it shouldn't be crazy difficult. And then further up, going up the stairs, we want there to be enough landing space because this guy also needs to waft at things and pick up orbs. And right here, the jump distances were the more technical ones because then, yeah, I failed it. That's why. Yeah, and right here, the last one, yes, this is a nice distance for throwing bombs at enemies by wafting the broom. Yeah, so that's how you can make use of scale and proportions to mold the environment. Okay, moving on. While I worked at the EdTech company, I also picked up some skills in instructional design. And turns out they were pretty useful also for games, in particular in designing tutorials and also puzzle games. So instructional design, simply put, is designing how instructions are given, usually involved in planning of course materials, and this can be for both online and in-person education. And I will talk about an instructional design systems framework that is commonly used in developing courses called the EDDI model. So in this model, there are 5 steps: analysis, design, development, implementation, and evaluation. And I will further explain what they are and elaborate on how they can be useful in the context of game design. Right, so the first step in the EDDI model is analysis. That is when you do some research on what you're going to make and get a big picture of what to create. This can be figuring out what your target audience are, or analyzing your learners' existing knowledge versus what you want to teach, and how to fill that knowledge gap. This is also where we look at top-level learning goals, like learning objectives, what the learners' needs are, what some resources will be needed in order to deliver the learning, etc. And a lot of these ideas can also be mapped to game design. So for example, target audience is probably something that you are already familiar with. That's basically who the players of the game are. And in figuring out the knowledge gaps in a game, this can be differences in player knowledge between different levels. Or if you're designing a tutorial for someone who has never played your game, it can be analyzing genre conventions. So for example, players might already know that, for example, a tower defense game is typically strategy-based. It involves defending a tower or territory and obstructing enemies by building contraptions. So analyzing what the player already knows helps us make decisions on what can be skimmed over and built on top of what players might already know, so then we can streamline the process. There's also the top learning goal, top-level learning goal, where we can ask questions like, what should the player be capable of after playing through the level? We can brainstorm a list of learning objectives to include, and then categorize them into must-haves and nice-to-haves in our planning. And with all that analysis done, with all that information, we can move on to the design phase in the EDDI system. The design phase is where you design the learning experience based on your analysis. And that's where we start looking at things like learning objectives, which is determining what information you want to teach, what the learning goals are. And once we have that, we can take the learning objectives and formulate a learning flow. This will be things like what topics to teach in which sequence. And it's also a good time to think about some exercises or what content you want to cover. Then comes communication strategy. Designing communication strategy is, simply put, how the learning should be delivered. Yeah, and translating these to game design, This can be what we want players to pick up. Is it a mechanic, or do we want them to get comfortable with some controls? How are different game elements combined? Yeah, so just bear in mind that when you're picking learning objectives, we want to also avoid overwhelming the player. And once we have those, we can consider things like difficulty progressions or the order of how mechanics are introduced or combined, so then we can put together an overview and have a better idea of how and when things are introduced in the game. And then in terms of communicating new information to players, we can think about things like UI. What is the HUD like? Will there be cutscenes? And if there is information text, when and where will they pop up? In this stage, it's very useful to make use of mockups and storyboards because they help us visualize the users or learners slash players learning experience, so then we can make adjustments accordingly. Now, on to development. In this stage, it's where we determine instructional strategies, medias, and methods, and it's also where the design is brought to life. So this is pretty straightforward. But we also do a thing where we validate learning resources, usually with stakeholders. So for example, if this was a course developed for a university, you will be talking to professors and running the product by them. So then you make sure that what you're developing meets the needs of the end users and that the learning objectives align with the curriculum. We also carry out a pilot test, which is to test the material on the real users, which is also students, and get insights about how delivery can be improved, or if the learning flow makes sense. Questions like whether learners feel like they have acquired new knowledge at all. Again, translating this to games, this is basically prototyping and testing the idea to see if it works, and if you, as a game designer, think that it does, you can do some validation. And in games context, you will be doing this with your players. It can be internal playtests, or asking questions like whether the tutorial or level has introduced elements that you want it to, and if the content covered is fun or useful for the progression of the game. Yeah, it's also a good stage to see how the development team in general feels about the game at this stage. Then, this very easily translates into an external playtest, where we get feedback and observations that gives us insights to how, like, what adjustments to make and how to iterate. It's for us to get an idea of how whether players feel like they are equipped with enough knowledge to play the game, or if something is missing. Hui, okay. The implementation stage in this EDI model is perhaps more relevant in instructional design because they actually have instructors that deliver the learning material. But I will quickly go over this anyway. This step is when you distribute the product to the intended audience. And that can be, for example, training your facilitators, like preparing your instructors for a learning course or training them on how to deliver the learning materials. It will also involve preparing the learners, making sure that they have what they need and are equipped for the course. They have the support that they need to access, and that, yeah, it may involve things like pre-course registrations or other forms of communication. And in games, this is rarer, but if you happen to be making an escape room of sorts, or a game that requires a game master, this will be a great time to train people that facilitate the delivery of your game experience. And for preparing learners in a game, since they likely already have what they need to run your game, we can instead use this step to remove distractions. So do a pass in the design where you go through the game and see if there are any unintended distractions that keep your players focusing on what they should be looking at. Yeah, ask if this can be simplified. If the answer is yes, then go do some decluttering. And the last phase of the framework is evaluation. In this model, designers evaluate if the learning was effective. by seeing if learners are satisfied, if they feel like they've learned something new, or sometimes they also do a difficulty assessment and look for points for improvement. So in games, this can be evaluating the effectiveness of the level, and we can ask questions like, did the players have a good time? Did they learn a new mechanic or a new lore about the game? Is there information that's useful for the next level or for the game progression in general? Because then we can take those points for improvement, take those things for points of improvement and adjust and tackle those issues. We can also reflect on the difficulty. Was there enough challenge in the level? Was it too little, too much? Or if there were things that are unclear to the player, and is there a simpler way to teach it? So yeah, that's an ADDIE model. It's great not only for organizing teaching materials, but also for designing tutorials and puzzle games. And now that we've gone through the system and how it can be used in games, next I'd like to go through and show how we applied this to Spectacle, the puzzle game that we created at Half Past Yellow. And let's begin by looking at a series. A nice thing to know, you can definitely look into it. There's more to this. There's also some composition basics that we can look at. And another favorite of mine is a series of books called 101 Things I Learned. I was first introduced to this in architecture school, but this is a whole series that gives you crash course on different topics beyond architecture and urban design. There's also something about product design, film, or even culinary art. So be sure to check it out. I highly encourage you to look into what creatives are doing to expand your toolbox, because on to the next point, most skills are transferable. It's okay if you feel like you're a generalist. I used to be super insecure about it. But I also realized knowing a little bit of everything made it much more easier for me to pivot between different creative fields. So if you're looking to pivot, just know that you need to be able to identify the overlaps, and then you can lean into it, bridge the gap, and you can make it work. Also, knowing what is good is a very valuable skill. You don't necessarily need to know, you don't necessarily need to be able to do everything on your own perfectly, but when you can explain and analyze why things are the way they are, you will be able to make improvements and find the right people for the task or for feedback. Imposter syndrome. I think we are all familiar with this, and I've struggled with this a lot. But I've also come to realize that it will always be a thing. But normalizing talking about it helps. So in a previous workplace of mine, my colleagues created a shared spreadsheet where we would note down how much we felt like an imposter on a scale from 1 to 10. And this was updated every other week. And just being able to see what other people feel or what they are going through helps a lot, because then it opens up a discussion and you can start talking about it, and then you realize, well, everyone's going through the same thing. We're just putting it on ourselves. Last but not least, stay curious. If you at any point feel too comfortable, consider picking up something new, join a game jam, start a new side project. If there are old skills that you haven't used in a while, go refresh your memory, because if you don't use it, you'll lose it. And that's all I have for you today. Massive thanks if you're still with me, and it's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much for this interesting talk and the examples shown from your game. We have time for questions. So if anybody wants to ask here, or I can handle the mic. Yes.
Thank you. Thanks for a great talk. One thing that I sort of just picked up at this beginning of your talk that I'm a little bit curious about, you mentioned, with architecture that everything was sort of based off an average male, right? Is that something you find in games as well as a common occurrence? You talked about measurements with like jump distance and those things. Like, what standard do you find that people use the most? And like, is there any?
I mean, it's a little bit of a different context, right? Because in games, the characters are what we create. and what is the average game character? Maybe a little bit. I see what you're saying, but definitely, like, we can make games that are built for midgets, and that could be fun. It could feel very different. It's just not very common. That's true. So yeah, a little bit.
Any more questions? Yeah.
I would like to ask when you started the new career path, how did the companies, like in the interviews, look at your CV? Because I'm also have changed careers, and it seems like it can be a positive thing, but also it can take it completely wrong and assume that you're like not prepared or kind of not reflect your experience and ability on your decisions.
Okay. So I think for me, the first pivot was going into 3D art. And at that time, I was also quite lucky because the company that I was applying for was an EdTech company, and I had interest in science to begin with. So it was like trying to note down what transferable skills there are from architecture to 3D art, or also games, but also just really keeping an open mind and learn continuously. Learning continuously was also one of the things that the company that I applied for really valued, so I think that also helped. But I think it's in general trying to figure out what you're good at, what else you would need to be good at in order to pivot to a new thing, and try to bridge that gap. And it's okay if you're not there yet. You just got to keep trying and believe that one day it'll work. And also take your time to explore all the different things, because I did that. If I had the mentality that I need to find the right thing ASAP, that would never have happened. So just take your time, explore the different things. It wouldn't take super long for you to find out what your interests are and what you're good at, and then you can take it from there.
Yeah, we have time for more questions. Also, if you have, yes.
Thank you for the talk. I wonder, the game you showed, is it out, and where can I play it if it is?
We're working on it. I mean, I showed 2 games. The puzzle game, the demo is out. For the tower defense game, we're still working on it, but we are looking for playtesters. So maybe, if you want to try.
I'll add you on LinkedIn then.
For sure, yeah.
Yeah, more questions? Yes.
This is super interesting, and it's kind of, I like this idea of the transferable skills. I was wondering, do you also have the opposite, like that there might be like habits if you come from one field to another that you have to unlearn?
A little bit, yes, but you learn to unlearn them. So one of the examples is when I transitioned from architecture to games. Yes, 3D modeling is an overlap, but in architecture, we do not build with mesh. We build with NURBS, which are like spline-based modeling, more accurate and mathematical. But how I thought, like how I deconstructed the things to build felt very different. So that was definitely a thing that I needed to unlearn. Moving into Blender was basically, like, it felt like starting from scratch, and it didn't feel good, because I was like, I know how to 3D model, but I don't. So yeah, that was definitely something that I struggled with. But I guess it's always like rinse and repeat. Do it more, then you'll remember the things that you should, and then architecture, modeling is probably, yeah, it's not in my brain anymore at this point. So.
Thank you. Do we have questions online? No. Okay. Maybe I can. Yes.
Sure. I discovered because at one point I also thought about pivoting to being an instructional designer. But I also worked with actual instructional designers, so then they talked a little bit about it, but not very much, and then I just looked into it. Yeah, but you can see patterns. Like when we make simulations, which is basically the course materials for learning science, there is the structure in there. It's just that they don't really explain it to you. Yeah.
Thank you. Anyone else who wants to ask a question? Or maybe then I can ask my question. So you mentioned that some other disciplines knowledge come handy, and of course you mentioned architecture and psychology, for example. Do you have anything that you used but you didn't expect that you could draw from that?
Are you referring to a specific theory or like
Or a
tools?
field or areas, tools as well, anything that you...
Oh, this is difficult because you can draw inspirations from so many things. Like sometimes, I mean, Pinterest, I guess, because like you also get things that you don't expect out of the blue, and then you're like, oh, that's cool, and then you go down a rabbit hole. That's actually how I found out about Monument Valley, because I was looking at work by MC Escher for my architectural project, and then I saw all these, ooh, cool things, cool art, what's this? And then there's that, and I was like, oh. So I guess it's just really to stay curious and look at all the different things. Yeah.
Maybe it was. Do we have any more questions, or maybe online? Somebody type in now. Then thank you for your talk again, and